June 1807, Wallowa Valley, snow still on the high ridges, and one of the longest retreats on the frontier is about to begin. We follow Chief Joseph to see why discipline and terrain could challenge both railroad and telegraph. June 1807, Wallowa Valley, Oregon Territory. Snow lingers on the high ridges, while the Imnaha and Wallowa run cold through meadow and pine. Families of the non-treaty Nez Perce break camp, under a federal deadline to move to the Lapwai Agency in Idaho. Their headman Joseph carries a father's charge to keep the graves of his people in this valley. Across the mountains, Department of the Columbia commander Oliver Otis Howard prepares to enforce removal. The stage is narrow and exact. Wallowa and Snake to the west, Clearwater and Bitterroot to the east, the high Lolo Trail between. The principal actors are clear. On the Nez Perce side, Joseph Lookingglass, White Bird, two Huel suit and their extended bands with women, elders, and children. On the United States side, General Howard at first, later John Gibbon in the Bitterroot, and Nelson A. Miles on the northern plains backed by cavalry infantry scouts and a thin line of telegraph. The armament is mixed on both sides, repeaters and single shots, a few light guns, and most decisive of all, fast horses and knowledge of the ground. The central question of this episode is direct. How did a disputed move order become a 4-month fighting withdrawal that crossed mountains, valleys, and prairies, and why did it end within sight of the Canadian line? We follow orders, routes, and engagements in strict chronology from White Bird Canyon to the Clearwater over the Lolo through the shock at Big Hole past Canyon Creek to the siege at Bear Paw. The significance reaches beyond one campaign. The Nez Perce War of 1877 reveals how policy, logistics, and geography can decide the fate of a moving community, and how disciplined rearguard tactics can preserve a column under pursuit. It also shows the limits of mobility once fresh columns winter and converging telegraph orders close the net. June 1855, Walla Walla Council on the Columbia Plateau. Territorial Governor Isaac Stevens and federal commissioners recognize a broad Nez Perce country and establish an agency at Lapwai. Chiefs who sign believe they have secured a framework that protects multiple village districts, including Wallowa, under federal faith. The discovery of gold in the Clearwater and Salmon basins within 5 years upends that framework. Mining roads, ferries, and way stations spread along the river canyons. Violence follows the traffic. June 1863. A second treaty redraws the reservation to a much smaller tract around Lapwai. Several bands refuse to sign, arguing that no council can sell what their fathers did not sell. From that year on, the United States recognizes treaty and non-treaty Nez Perce. The administrative split becomes a daily reality, rations in schools for those on the Lapwai rolls, arrests and summonses for those who remain in off-reservation districts such as Wallowa. Through the late 1860s, homestead entries and cattle leases push into the valleys. Local sheriffs and posses enforce property claims that the non-treaty headmen do not accept. March 1869 to mid-1870s. Federal peace policy rhetoric grows while authority fragments. The Department of the Interior manages agencies and annuities. The War Department is tasked to enforce orders when agents declare disaffection. Telegraph lines reach more forts on the Columbia and Yellowstone corridors, shortening command time. But the legal basis of many field actions rests on contested treaty readings. Schools at Lapwai and allied missions expand. Agency rules pressure seasonal travel and bride wealth exchanges. Demands to cede horses for civilizing labor meet quiet resistance. Each of these measures narrows the practical space for non-treaty life without delivering equivalent protection from settler assault. June 1871. Joseph the Elder dies, charging his sons to keep the graves of their people in Wallowa. 1873 sees a brief administrative pause. An executive action hints that Wallowa might be reserved for the band, but by 1875, that signal is reversed under settler pressure and surveys resume. Ranchers crowd the best bottomlands. Disputes over branding and trespass multiply. County courts favor newcomers. The Northern Pacific Survey parties cross Montana. Freighting corridors tighten the net of posts and depots that can sustain a chase. Winter, 1876, spring, 1877. After the Great Sioux War shocks the frontier interior, and Army leaders vow to prevent another multi-territory conflict. At Lapwai, Agent John Monteith and Department of the Columbia Commander Oliver Otis Howard set a hard deadline for all non-treaty bands to report to the reservation in early June. The order is clear: gather at Lapwai, sign rolls, move to assigned tracks. Howard's objective is limited and administrative consolidation to reduce friction, but his constraint is severe. Scattered regular companies, long supply lines over mud and snowmelt, and a civilian population that expects instant protection. On the Nez Perce side, objectives diverge but overlap. Joseph argues to avoid war and keep the people together on ancestral ground. Looking Glass emphasizes prudence and negotiation. White Bird's camp is already nursing grief from earlier killings by settlers. Constraints are stark. No secure legal title to Wallowa. No reliable recourse when county men raid stock or abuse the vulnerable, and the knowledge that once the lodges enter Lapwai, they will be dependent on rations and agency rules. Materially, the non-treaty bands have fast horse repeaters captured or traded over years and deep knowledge of watershed routes. They lack ammunition reserves, wagon transport, and any friendly depot. Immediate triggers arrive in sequence. Early June 1877, camps assemble near Tolo Lake to prepare for the forced move. A small group of young men breaks from the main councils and raids settler homesteads to avenge earlier murders of kin. Several civilians are killed. Joseph and other headmen convene to restrain further bloodshed, but the killings give the agent and the department legal ground to demand arrests and unconditional compliance. Howard issues orders to seize the perpetrators and to march the bands to Lapwai without delay. A few days later, volunteers or militia elements probe Looking Glass's separate village, persuading his following that negotiation is now futile. This blow fuses previously divergent councils into one moving column. By mid-June, the campaign logic is set. United States objectives arrest named offenders, enforce consolidation at Lapwai, and prevent the conflict from spilling across territories. Constraints mixed regular and volunteer units, limited mountain mobility, and ammunition and forage that must be freighted at trail speed. Logistics snapshot companies of cavalry and infantry, totaling several hundred effectives, one or two. Light mountain howitzers in the earliest contacts rations for weeks rather than months. Remounts, scarce reliance on Nez Perce or settler scouts of uneven reliability. Nez Perce objectives: avoid annihilation and confinement. Keep families intact, and if pressed, break contact long enough to reach a political refuge first among the Bitterroot settlements by parley, then perhaps with the Crow, and failing that, the Canadian line. Constraints: hundreds of non-combatants and large horse herds, cartridge belts that cannot be replaced in the field, and elders and children whose pace fixes the daily march. Logistics snapshot: several hundred fighting men, most mounted, mixed rifles and revolvers with limited ammunition, abundant remounts at the start, pack horses rather than wagons, food from cached stores, hunting and purchase when possible, no external supply except what the column can trade for or seize. Thus, proximate causes an inflexible relocation order, retaliatory killings, a punitive pro-block, to deep causes contested treaties, land rush pressures, and administrative reversals. The column steps off, not toward battle, but toward a narrow hope to move faster than summonses and telegraph orders, and to solve day by day the arithmetic of distance, forage, and cartridges before winter solves it for them. Late dawn, 17th June 1807, White Bird Canyon, Idaho territory. Fog hangs in the grass basins above the salmon, while Captain David Perry leads mixed companies of the 1st Cavalry and mounted infantry toward a Nez Perce village strung along Willow and Creek. On the Nez Perce side, fighters from White Bird's band ride out with a white flag and an interpreter to parley. The ground is broken and steep. Horses bunch on the ridgelines. A nervous shot cracks from the rear of the volunteer line. Skirmishers answer on instinct. Nez Perce marksmen drop to the reverse slopes and fire, in deliberate rhythm, hitting horses first, men second. A small mountain howitzer trails behind on the rocky track and never stabilizes. Signalers cannot keep flags visible through fog and folds of ground. Bugle calls bounce off the basin walls and blur. Within an hour, the army line loses control of mounts and cohesion. Casualties fall fast near the saddle, where the crest crosses to the village. Perry orders a withdrawal north toward Grangeville. The immediate effects are decisive. Army dead and lost horses litter the ridge. The Nez Perce column secures time, gathers dropped carbines and cartridge belts, and breaks camp. In order, women and children moving first, rear guards last. The campaign shifts from relocation to pursuit. 18 June 1807, Lewiston, Idaho. Telegraph keys chatter through a single operator on the riverfront. Messages from General Oliver Otis Howard to department headquarters and to Fort Walla Walla stack as the single line shares traffic with civilian priority notices. Ammunition requests travel faster than wagons, but not fast enough to help Perry. Scouts report that the non-treaty bands are doubling back across the salmon to confuse pursuit. Settler families along the Clearwater load wagons for flight to agency ground. Militia committees meet and demand instant reinforcements. At Lapwai, the agency tries to keep Treaty Nez Perce from being misidentified in the panic. Interpreters ride constantly between the telegraph office and the parade ground, clarifying which chiefs are on the rolls and which are not. The United States objective tightens, prevent a crossing into Montana, and compel surrender before harvest season labor drains the volunteer pool. Oliver Otis Howard, Telegraph, Lewiston, Idaho, 18 June 1807. The non-treaty Indians have attacked settlers near White Bird and defeated Captain Perry in the canyon. I am moving with cavalry and infantry to compel surrender. Send ammunition rations and pack animals without delay, and notify Fort Walla Walla to forward all available companies. Late June 1807. Salmon River Country, Idaho. Heat rises off the rock. The Nez Perce column, Joseph's people White Birds camp and allied families, executes a deliberate misdirection, crossing and recrossing the salmon at steep fords that punish hooves and shins. Couriers from Howard's column lose hours locating the right braid of trail in country where switchbacks stack like cords of wood. On the Nez Perce side, scouts watch dust plumes by day and cook fires by night, reading the Army's position without revealing their own. Ammunition is counted with care. Men carry a small reserve of cartridges in tanned pouches tied tight with rawhide. The column keeps a strict order of march horse herds bracketed by mounted fighters, children, and elders, centered with pack horses' rear guards, trading long shots with overeager scouts. Immediate effects: the Army expends time and forage chasing ghosts on the river bends, and the Nez Perce regain the initiative long enough to aim their movement toward the Clearwater. 11 to 12 of July, 1807. South Fork, Clearwater, Idaho Territory. Afternoon heat, then evening wind. Howard's infantry and detachments of cavalry push onto the benchlands above a Nez Perce village near the ford. The United States fires a few shells from a light piece to disrupt the lodges. The effect is noise and confusion more than material damage. Runners pass among Joseph Lookingglass and White Bird. Decision hold just long enough to keep the ford open and the trail ahead clear, then break contact at night. The fight settles into disciplined exchange. Nez Perce marksmen pick targets at ranges that favor repeaters. Army skirmishers return fire from sage and basalt outcrops. Telegraph traffic from Lewiston warns that reinforcements are days away, not hours. Couriers reconnect companies strung out over miles of ridge road. An interpreter at the agency tries to relay a message offering terms. It arrives too late to matter. Just after midnight, the Nez Perce lift lodges and slip off the bench, crossing the ford under muffled hooves. Immediate effects: the Army holds ground at dawn, but the column has vanished into the timbered draws that lead toward Lolo Pass. Mid-July 1877. Lolo Trail, Idaho to Montana. Snow patches linger in shadow even as the sun bakes the south faces. The trail is narrow a spine, with steep drop-offs and long, dry stretches between water. Nez Perce scouts ride far forward to check springs. Women on the move ration water by lodge group. On the United States side, pack trains struggle on switchbacks. Brake ropes burn palms. A single broken mule can stall a company. Messages from Howard to subordinate officers lag 1 to 2 days behind the column's real position. By the time an order to force the pace reaches a captain, the lead is already over the next divide. Down at Missoula, Captain Charles Rawn raises a small force of soldiers and townsmen and throws a makeshift barrier across the mouth of Lolo Canyon. Interpreters carry terms back and forth. Pass peacefully. Keep order in the Bitterroot, buy supplies at fair prices, leave the valley quickly. The parley holds. The Nez Perce file by in long columns, riders leading loaded horses. Children swaddled in cradle boards, guards scanning the ridges. Settler anxiety rises, but the only seizure is of time hours that the Army cannot recover. Late July to early August, 1807. Bitterroot Valley, Montana Territory. Heat shimmers over hayfields. The Nez Perce keep strict camp discipline, trading quietly for flour coffee and ammunition where they can find it. United States scouts follow at a distance, counting lodges, noting the number of spare horses, reporting on the health of the herd and the presence of travois. In Helena and Deer Lodge, telegraph chatter hardens public opinion. Editorials denounce perceived leniency at Lolo and demand that the next commanders strike hard. Colonel John Gibbon answers that expectation. He gathers available companies, secures a few carts and a light piece, and marches south and east toward the Big Hole country. Couriers ride to coordinate with Howard, but distances and rough trail turn intended convergences into near misses. Immediate effects: the Nez Perce enjoy a short window of relative rest, but each day on the flats increases the risk that 2 United States columns will finally arrive at once. 9 August 1807. Big Hole Valley, Montana Territory. Night temperatures drop. A frost ring bites the willows. The Nez Perce camp lies along the river lodges, grouped by band. Sentries scan the dark, but Gibbon's men, guided by local scouts, close to attack positions before first light. The incident that follows is swift and brutal, a rush into sleeping lodges, a shock that fragments families before fighters can seize the high ground. Nez Perce, men and women rally crossing open meadow under fire to reach the timbered knoll that dominates the field. Gibbon's infantry entrench and endure counterfire. Water carriers crawl to the river and back, with canteens under a hail of rounds. Telegraph cannot help here. The wire lies many miles away. Orders move by voice whistle and hand signal. By evening, the pressure is fully changed. What began as a series of marches and negotiations is now a fight for survival, with families at the center of the line. Night brings a break. The Nez Perce cut their way out, leaving dead in the grass and smoke over the knoll. The United States holds the field, but cannot pursue it once. Casualties and exhaustion fix Gibbon to the timber. Immediate effects: the Nez Perce keep the column together and moving, but at terrible cost. The army absorbs losses, yet closes the net by drawing fresh formations toward the plains. Signals delays, and the hard limits of summer mountain logistics have carried both sides to the edge of a decisive phase. Early August, 1807. Bitter route to Big Hole. Colonel John Gibbon's District of Montana column steps off with about 160 infantry, 40 cavalry, a handful of scouts, and a light piece, marching light to close on the Nez Perce encampment, reported along the Big Hole River. Howard's Department of the Columbia column trails, days behind its infantry, slowed by pack trains and switchbacks. Rules transmitted from departmental headquarters remain administrative, on paper arrest. The named killers and compel movement to Lapwai, but Gibbon's written intent shifts to battlefield terms. Once contact appears, certain strike at dawn, seize the village and hold it until Howard arrives. On the Nez Perce side, the column contains several hundred fighting men spread among Joseph Lookingglass White Bird, and other headmen with women, elders, and children at the center of the marching order, and a large horse herd that defines daily pace. Dawn on 9 August. Big Hole Valley. Gibbon's line rushes through willow and lodge rows in the near dark. Surprise is real and costly. Non-combatants are caught in the first volleys. Fighters sprint for timbered knolls that command the meadow. What follows is a day of reciprocal shock. United States infantry digs in on a low rise, exchanging fire with Nez Perce marksmen who have seized better ground. Water bearers crawl under fire. A cart and the light piece are dragged into position, more as a symbol than a weapon. Ammunition expenditure climbs on both sides. Casualty ranges recorded in Army returns and later tallies vary, but the pattern is consistent: dozens killed and wounded in the lodges and the first hour. Dozens more through the day on both sides as the fight fixes to the hill. After action summaries by Gibbon credit his men with holding under heavy fire. Nez Perce recollections emphasize the recovery from surprise and the deliberate counter that opened an escape lane. That night, the lodges are gone. The column breaks east again, carrying wounded and shocked children, leaving both sides to bury their dead. United States pursuit pauses to care for its own casualties and to reorganize. Gibbon's field note is terse and professional, the tone of a commander who has done what he believes the situation required and has paid for it. In the following days, couriers finally synchronize Gibbon and Howard at greater distance than planned. Both columns move, but the operational initiative has already returned to the moving village. Mid to late August. Big Hole to Camas Meadows. The Nez Perce march route bends across high benches and coulees where a night strike can cripple a pack train. Scouts find that chance at Camas Meadows. In darkness, mounted men/hobbles cut lashings and stampede mules. It is a logistical blow rather than a killing action, but it buys time that rations and cartridges cannot. United States reports after Camas Meadows acknowledge the fragility of movement in this country. A string of tired animals is a single point of failure. Howard's infantry makes ground by day, loses it in the hours required to repair lashings and recover scattered stock. The Nez Perce riding remounts, and knowing each seep and spring convert knowledge of the ground into days. Orders travel by wire, where wire exists by courier elsewhere. From the Department of the Columbia to subordinate posts, the guidance hardens, block the passes to the Yellowstone, and cut the route to the British line. Colonel Samuel Sturgis moves with elements of the 7th Cavalry along the Yellowstone corridor. Farther east, the Department of the Platte watches the Powder River country and the approaches to the Missouri. The policy frame is still removal to Lapwai, but the operational goal has become containment at any defensible choke point. Early September. Yellowstone Basin to Canyon Creek. The Nez Perce angles southeast, stealing marches along broken terrain that hides dust and diffuses pursuit. Sturgis, riding on fresher grass and holding better lines of communication to supply posts, tries to force a pin near Canyon Creek. The ground is a tangle of arroyos, basalt shelves, and sage slopes. The Nez Perce response is the same pattern. Rich, sharper rear guards take the high points and trade long shots, while herds and non-combatants thread the safer draws. Reports from both sides agree on the result. Sturgis bloodies the rear, but cannot close the trap. He underestimates the time required to work around the coulees. By the hour, his men arrive to cut a lane the column has passed. Casualty tables and post-action returns list handfuls killed and wounded. Here, a steady attrition that nevertheless cannot account for the majority of losses in this campaign. Those are borne by cold fatigue illness and the constant stress of motion under arms. Howard's field orders emphasize discipline and restraint where civilians are present, but the tenor of volunteer committees and newspapers is less patient. Along the Yellowstone and the settlements north of the Musselshell, rumors of raids and atrocities outrun facts. Agents at Lapwai and elsewhere telegraph reminders that Treaty Nez Perce remain in their districts and must not be conflated with the moving column. Interpreters and agency policemen labor to separate panic from policy. The on-the-ground effect across late summer is a tightening chain of sentry posts, militia musters, and nervous stockades. Traffic on the stage lines thins. Farms near exposed fords are temporarily abandoned. These civilian displacements, though local and brief, add political pressure to finish the pursuit before winter. Mid to late September. Toward the Bear Paw. The Nez Perce turned northeast, aiming for the low blue line of the Bear Paw Mountains and the Canadian border beyond. It is the rational objective left once the Crow declined to offer refuge, and the Lakota under Sitting Bull are known to be far north. Ammunition is now counted in the most literal way. A man holds cartridges in his hand and weighs them against the hours to the line. Horses show hip bones. Hooves crack on alkali flats. Nights cut hard. The column still maintains order bands grouped, herds bracketed guards outward, but the pace is no longer an expression of advantage. It is a calculation of endurance. Colonel Nelson. A. Miles moves out from Fort Keogh with mounted infantry cavalry companies, scouts, and a small artillery detachment. His orders are clearer than those that govern the opening phase intercept and compel surrender. He has advantages the earlier pursuers lacked: fresh men, shorter lines to supply, and the strategic benefit of convergence with Howard's worn column, and he uses them to shape a blocking action rather than a chase. Scouts find the Nez Perce camped along a tributary north of the Bear Paw Range. Miles closes with speed, planning a strike into the village at first light to seize people rather than positions. Morning of 30 September. The first rush reaches part of the camp. Lodges burn, families scatter, fighters grab rifles and run to the nearest rises where the short grass turns to shale and scrub. Then the geometry of the fight emerges. The Nez Perce refuse the urge to countercharge and instead dig. Rifle pits, shallow but effective, face the approaches. Fields of fire are plotted by eye over the few hundred yards that matter. United States companies try multiple axes into the position. The artillery fires over open sights. The effect is not decisive. The ground is too broken, the wind erratic. Once the initial shock passes, the action settles into a siege bounded by snow squalls and hunger. Casualty returns from the Bear Paw are again uneven across sources, but the pattern is legible. Several dozen killed and wounded on both sides in the opening day, and the following exchanges with non-combatants among the dead from the first surprise. The humanitarian situation becomes the decisive condition. Wounded on both sides require care that the weather defeats. Rations run thin for the surrounded. Water is fetched at risk across fire lanes. A surgeon's note among the army papers records hands burned by cold metal lips split by dry wind, and a count of blankets that does not match need. Two short texts from the record fix the tenor of command at this stage. One is an order, one is an after-action line. Seize the village if possible and prevent escape toward the British line. Spare women and children wherever the ground and fire allow. Miles to commanding officers, Bear Paw position. 30 September 1877. We held the heights under constant fire until our cartridges were nearly gone and the storm cut the line of sight. The families were behind us and we would not leave them. Unattributed Nez Perce recollection recorded years later, referencing the first days at Bear Paw. Across the siege, delegations move under flags of truce. Howard arrives near the close, his worn infantry, a proof of the months behind them. Messages pass about surrender terms, about the safety of the wounded, about the fate of those who lay down arms. Runners sent to Sitting Bull do not return in time to shape the outcome. On 5 October, Joseph walks forward. His words about cold death and children enter the nation's print and become the emblem of the campaign's end. The hard administrative reality that follows is different from early assurances. The main body surrenders into United States custody and is transported east, not to Lapwai. Small groups break out in the confusion and reach Canada, where they join those who had already crossed a point that later memory sometimes expands into a larger success than the record supports. Here, the script marks a simple boundary between fact and folklore. The majority did not escape. A few did. Through this final phase, non-combatants remain the fixed center of every tactical choice. Rear guards by minutes so that a child can mount, so that a travois can cross a gully, so that elders can be lifted to a safer draw. The cost is counted in men who do not return from a knoll or a cut bank. On the United States side, surgeons and chaplains note their own humanitarian calculus: how many litters they can spare to retrieve enemy wounded under fire, how to parcel hardtack to women and children who approach the lines during lulls. These acts do not erase the structure of the campaign, but they belong to its plain record. The confrontation closes with winter and convergence, deciding what maneuver and negotiation could not. The march rendered across dates and ground, White Bird to Clearwater to Lolo, Big Hole to Canyon Creek to Bear Paw, proves that a community can move under arms for months when led with discipline, and when the terrain can be read as a map of options. It also proves that rail telegraph and multi-column pursuit can narrow those options to a single snowed ridge when policy is consistent and supply holds. The orders that began as administrative instructions to gather at Lap Y end 4 months later as field commands to fix flank and compel. In that shift lies the campaign's shape and its human cost. Early snow, 30 September 1807, Bear Paw Mountains, Montana Territory. The turning point is a siege that tightens hour by hour until choice narrows to 2 outcomes: surrender with the main body intact, or a breakout that abandons wounded and children to the weather. On one side stands Colonel Nelson M. Miles, with mounted infantry cavalry companies, scouts, and a light artillery detachment. His objective is explicit: intercept the Nez Perce before they reach the British line and compel their submission. On the other side, Joseph Looking-Glass White Bird and the remaining headmen hold a shallow ridge cut with rifle pits, their families just behind the crest. Their objective is survival, with cohesion measured now in cartridges and minutes rather than miles. Constraints shape every order. Ammunition within the village is low after months of fighting withdrawals. Cartridges are counted in the hand and rationed by need. Rations are thinner still. Dried meat and flour, nearly gone foraging, made impossible by the ring of United States pickets. Water lies in exposed dips and draws swept by fire. Weather turns from cold wind to hard squalls. Wet clothing becomes a second enemy, stealing heat and strength. United States constraints are different. Miles has fresh men and short lines to supply, but his first rush has failed to seize the whole camp, and the ground favors the defenders once they dig. He must press without burning through ammunition too fast, and without allowing a night breakout to slip past his lines in blowing snow. The initiative swings early. Miles's dawn attack scatters part of the village and inflicts shock, but the Nez Perce recover the ridge and refuse the urge to countercharge. They make the knoll into a position, not a panic. From that moment, time becomes the decisive resource. Each hour without resupply weakens the surrounded more than the besieger. Each hour of cold forces hard choices about who receives a blanket, who receives the last hot meal, and who carries water under fire. When Howard's worn column approaches from the south, convergence completes the trap and ends the chance that a single bold maneuver can change the geometry. Loss fixes the moment's character. Ollicott Joseph's brother is killed in the opening day. Looking-Glass falls later in the siege, shot near the lines. As he moves between positions, his death a blow to any hope of slipping past the ring. 2 Hool Suit had already died at Big Hole. His absence is felt in the deliberate way the rifle pits are sighted and manned by men who learned under his eye. Names matter here because families remember them. In winter counts short painted rows of horses, snow marks, and lodge symbols that stand for men lost at a cold ridge where the short grass met shale. Women carry water and nurse wounds in dugouts roofed with hide. Children shiver under smoke-blackened canvas that cannot keep sleet out of seams. Orders and admissions are plain in the record. Nelson. A Miles Report, Bear Paw, Montana Territory. October 1807. These Indians displayed a courage and skill in their warfare that elicited the admiration of all. Their leaders maintained discipline under fire and protected their families with a tenacity that would have honored any troops. It is an admission against interest written by the commander who won the siege. It also clarifies why surrender rather than annihilation marks the end. The United States can finish the work by waiting for cold and hunger, but Miles chooses to offer terms once the tactical outcome is certain, and his own supplies must also be guarded. The humanitarian calculus is relentless. United States surgeons dress wounds on both sides as opportunities allow. Chaplains note the burial details in terse lines. In the village, elders give up blankets to younger men expected to hold the rifle pits through the night. Mothers wrap children in stripped lodge liners. The thin stream of water fetched under fire tastes of snow and smoke. Ration issues on the United States side are recorded and guarded. None can be spared without order. On the 5th day of this arithmetic, the balance breaks. Runners sent north to Sitting Bull do not return in time. Ammunition is nearly gone. Snow squalls erase the line of sight and freeze hands to metal. Joseph walks forward. His surrender changes the campaign's logic, but not its costs. White Bird leads a small party that slips away in the confusion and reaches Canada. Most do not. The immediate effect is a transfer of custody. The longer effect announced in later administrative papers is removal eastward rather than return to Lapwai. The path of displacement runs from Bear Paw to holding at Fort Keogh, then to Fort Leavenworth, then to Indian Territory. Disease and climate exact a second toll, far from the fields where the rifle pits are now just shallow scars. The turning point, therefore, is double a tactical decision at a ridge in early snow and a policy decision that routes survivors away from their country. Evidence-based counterfactuals are narrow and must be kept within the record. If Sturgis had successfully fixed the column at Canyon Creek in mid-September, the Bear Paw siege might have begun 2 weeks earlier with warmer weather and higher Nez Perce ammunition stocks, increasing the chance of a breakout by speed rather than endurance. If the Crow had offered refuge and mounts in late August, the column's remount pool and powder resupply might have supported a dash to the border that Miles could not have blocked with a single column. The weight of dispatch time supply holes and distances argues that both scenarios were possible, but unlikely once departmental convergence was ordered and telegraph coordination improved after Big Hole. This turning point also returns us to the structural forces set in motion in P2. The deep causes contested treaties land rushes into river valleys. Administrative reversals on Wallowa created a situation in which an administrative order to relocate carried the power of arms behind it. The proximate causes June killings near Tolo Lake and the probe against Looking Glass's camp converted that policy into pursuit. At Bear Paw, the same structure closes the arc. Telegraph and rail shorten United States command loops. Multi-column pursuit and fresh mounts bring numerical and logistical pressure to bear just as season and weather become allies to the besieger. On the Nez Perce side, the advantages that had defined the campaign knowledge of the ground-fast horses, disciplined rear guards cannot offset ammunition, depletion exposure, and the moral weight of protecting non-combatants under snow. Who, where, and when can be stated in one line, and understood fully only in the lines that follow. Joseph Miles Howard, White Bird. Looking Glass, Ollicott. Bear Paw Mountains. 30 September to 5 October, 1807. The objective for the United States is to stop a mobile community at the edge of a border. The constraint is ground that resists decisive assaults. The objective for the Nez Perce is to keep families and cohesion until a political refuge appears. The constraint is measured in cartridges, blankets, and the breath of children in sleet. The immediate effect is surrender in the majority and a small breakout that reaches Canada. The human cost is written in names and winter marks then extended by trains and riverboats to a climate where graves will be dug far from Wallowa. The structural forces ensure that once the siege begins in earnest, the outcome is bounded by weather and supply, rather than by courage which both sides possess and both sides record. Late autumn 1807 begins with custody and paperwork. After the surrender at the Bear Paw Army escorts moved the main Nez Perce prisoner body, first to Fort Keogh on the Yellowstone then, by stages to Fort Leavenworth on the Missouri, and in 1878 to Indian Territory, Big Acorn under the Quapaw Agency. Arrests target a short list of named combatants. Most detainees are classed simply as prisoners of war pending civil direction. Reservation boundaries on paper point back to Lapwai, but Department of the Interior memoranda make clear that return is not imminent. Rations and annuities will be issued only where the department can supervise them. In Indian Territory, the roll books expand and the ration tables tighten with entries for flour, bacon, coffee, and soap that never quite match need in a malarial climate. School placements begin soon after arrival mission classrooms, and for a few children transfer to distant industrial boarding schools such as Carlisle, where hair is cut names are anglicized, and language use is punished under standard rules of the era. The policy arc visible in the Office of Indian Affairs, annual reports for 1870-1880 is consistent consolidate ration school, and when Congress authorizes it, a lot. The land story in the Northwest continues at the same time without those who hope to return quickly. Mining and grazing leases expand along the Clearwater and Salmon. Rail spurs and freight roads tied to the Northern Pacific's push across Montana in 1883 harden new patterns of access. Timber hay and water rights are recorded in county ledgers that only occasionally note older village grounds. When the Dawes Act becomes law in 1887, the logic of allotment begins to break the communal land base at Lapwai into individually assigned parcels. Surplus categories open the door to additional non-native entry. Agency correspondence in the late 1880s records disputes over fence lines, irrigation ditches, and right-of-way, the practical expressions of a legal shift already anticipated in the department's earlier removal orders. Demography and health statistics track the price of exile. Prisoner rolls compiled at Fort Leavenworth in late 1877 and Quapaw Agency returns through 1879-1880 record a mortality rate far above peacetime baselines. The causes read like a frontier medical ledger: fever consumption, the measles, dysentery. Births occur, but the ratio tilts toward loss until acclimatization and better housing reduce exposure. Army Surgeon's notes and the Commissioner of Indian Affairs reports both remark on the climate mismatch between the Northern Plateau and Indian Territory, and on the secondary effects of poor water and crowding. When, after years of petitions and testimony, the department authorizes returns in 1885, the separation is permanent in another sense. One group is sent to the Nez Perce Reservation at Lapwai, while Joseph and many of his closest followers are assigned to the Colville Reservation in Washington Territory. A census snapshot at decade's end shows a community divided by administrative line as well as by geography. Cultural continuance does not cease in the ledger books. The autonym Nimi Pew appears quietly in letters and later publications, as elders insist on proper names for themselves and their foods. Seasonal movements are curtailed by agency rules, but ceremonies adapt. Root feasts and first salmon observances continue in smaller circles. Longhouse worship weaves older forms with Christian teachings introduced by missions. Language persists in homes and camp circles even as schoolrooms penalize it. Word lists and Bible translations produced by missionaries inadvertently become aids to later revitalization. The record is not only written by officials. Family winter counts in adjacent plains communities mark the 1877 campaign with pictographs of lodges in snow and men in hats on small horses. Nez Perce remembrance takes other forms, story cycles that fix place names to roots beadwork and quill work that preserve pattern grammars and songs carried to powwows in the Northwest and after removal to stomp grounds far from Wallowa. Memory on the landscape grows institutional shape over the 20th century. Big Hole Battlefield and the Bear Paw site are set aside as federal commemorations. Annual gatherings at both bring Nemiapeu families and local communities together under flags and song. In the Wallowa country, the Wallowa Homeland Site and the Tomkaleeks celebration reestablish a place to camp and to honor ancestors near the Old Valley. The town that once excluded return hosts Chief Joseph Days with rodeo pageantry, and alongside it, a quieter homeland gathering tends older forms. The Nez Perce National Historical Park links dozens of sites across Idaho, Oregon, Washington, and Montana, making the route of 1807 legible to the public as an archipelago of ground where decisions were made and losses counted. Administration never disappears from the story, but its direction changes. Court cases and congressional testimony in the early 20th century revisit treaty language and compensation. Later, tribal governments develop fisheries programs and cultural departments under federal compacts that acknowledge inherent rights. At Lapwai, the Nez Perce tribe builds out a fisheries division that works on salmon and steelhead restoration across the Snake and Clearwater basins. In Washington, the Chief Joseph Band at Colville maintains programs that balance grazing forestry and cultural protection on allotted and trust lands. Language revitalization moves from informal circles to formal classes and teacher training supported by grants. Dictionaries and curricula in Nimiapeu anchor younger speakers to a grammar and a sound older than any agency file. The written record that allows this continuity to be traced includes voices from all sides. Nelson A. Miles's field dispatches and later personal recollections preserve the Army's view of the siege and its adversary with unusual respect, including his admission that the Nez Perce displayed courage and skill that elicited the admiration of all. John Gibbon's official report on the Big Hole engagement lays out the costs and his justification for the dawn strike. Oliver Otis Howard's essays on Nez Perce Joseph in the North American Review attempt to reconcile his orders with the outcome, and with Joseph's national reputation. The annual reports of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs for 1877 to 1885 document the transfers to Fort Leavenworth and Indian Territory. The ration issues the school enrollments and eventually the divided return. Standard histories: Alvin M. Josephy Jr.'s The Nez Perce Indians and the Opening of the Northwest. Jerome A. Green's Nez Perce, Summer 1877, and Elliott West's The Last Indian War sift those archives and oral accounts to fit dates to ground and policy to lived consequence. Together they form a spine of sources, orders, returns, essays, and syntheses. Present day, Namipu live in two principal centers that reflect the administrative split of 1885. The Nez Perce tribe, headquartered at Wallowa, Idaho, administers government health, education, fisheries, and cultural programs on and around the Nez Perce Reservation. Descendants of the Chief Joseph Band reside primarily within the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation in Washington, with communities at Nispelem and along the Columbia and Okanogan drainages. Cross-border kinship ties remain with families whose ancestors reached Canada, and with neighbors whose winter counts and diaries recorded 1877 from different horizons. Commemorative runs and rides retrace parts of the route each summer. School programs teach map literacy through the place names that carry older meanings. The legal file now also contains winds that face forward water rights, compacts habitat agreements, sacred site protections, and repatriation, under federal law, have returned some remains and objects to Namipu custody. The cultural file holds new recordings of elders' speech, new dictionaries, and new songs. The administrative file, still there, still dense, shows that survival required mastery of forms as well as of trails. In the end, aftermath and continuance are the same line drawn across different paper. The orders that sent families south in 1878 explain why memory and language take on the work of return, and the programs that thrive at Wallowa and Colville today are answers to a policy that once tried to end the route in snow. The scholarly center of gravity holds on 3 points. First, the Nez Perce campaign of 1807 demonstrates exceptional operational skill by a small mobile community under multiple headmen who preserved cohesion across mountains and plains for months. Second, United States success turned less on battlefield brilliance than on institutional reach. Telegraph coordination, converging columns, fresh formations, and winter pressure closed options that tactics alone could not reopen. Third, the surrender at the Bear Paw produced not a negotiated reintegration, but a policy outcome, removal and division that shaped Namipu life for generations. Several issues remain contested. Casualty totals at Big Hole vary across Army returns and tribal recollections, and the distribution of non-combatant deaths within the first hour remains sensitive. The opening shot at White Bird is assigned to different actors in different testimonies, a point that matters because it frames subsequent orders. Joseph's role is debated. Some historians emphasize him as principal strategist. Others stress a collective command in which Looking Glass White Bird Ollicott and others set key moves while Joseph anchored diplomacy and morale. The scale and timing of escape to Canada are also read differently. The record shows small parties, including White Bird's, reaching refuge, while later memory sometimes magnifies that success. Finally, assessments diverge on whether administrative choices after surrender violated earlier assurances of return to Wallowa or reflected the policy norms of the period. The documentary trail supports both a record of expressed intent and a contrary record of execution. The durable legacy operates on 3 planes. In doctrine, the United States Army drew practical lessons on mounted screens, pack train vulnerability, night strikes against transport, and the value and limits of mountain howitzers and converging columns. Those points recur in frontier manuals and later memoirs. In policy, the war accelerated a template already forming consolidation at agency centers, schooling under strict language rules, and a decade on allotment that fragmented communal land. In symbol, Joseph's public voice, amplified by speeches and press, fixed the war in national memory as a test of law, endurance, and restraint, while Nez Perce continuities in language, ceremony, and place work kept the story anchored to lived communities rather than to monuments alone. Taken together, the campaign sits where tactics meet structured, disciplined rear guards and fast horses bought time, but railheads telegraph and winter converted time into a net. It is remembered as an action of courage on both sides and as an administrative hinge whose consequences were borne by families. It endures because a 4-month route across named ground shows with unusual clarity how policy, logistics, and leadership decide the fate of a people in motion. You just traveled from White Bird to Bear Paw, a campaign where terrain, logistics, and winter decided fate. Was the true turning point Big Hole or the converging orders before Bear Paw? Which moment will stay with you the longest? Thanks for watching.